Hi friends, Namaste. I am C. Bhaktavatsal Rao, Ajit Singhi Chair Professor, Department of Management Studies, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. It is my pleasure to introduce the course Strategy and Technology, a practical primer, which I propose to offer through NPTEL Swayam platform. I have over 47 years of diversified experience in strategic and operational leadership of various corporations in India, some of them subsidiaries of global MNCs. My last formal assignment was as Executive Chairman and Managing Director of Hospira Healthcare India Private Limited, a Pfizer company. I have offered two courses on NPTEL Swayam platform: Entrepreneurship, Perspectives of Business Strategy and Economic Development, and Leadership for India Inc., Practical Concepts and Constructs. These two courses, one of them offered twice, have been significant successes in their respective categories. I am happy to now offer this course titled Strategy and Technology, a Practical Primer. I am confident that the learners who enroll for this course would benefit from this course, as was the case with the other courses. Strategy is an important component of driving growth. It envisages, plans, and executes for a desirable future. Technology is at the core of whatever has been happening in terms of progress and development in the world over the last several centuries. And the impact of technology has only grown in importance over the last few decades. Technology savvy strategy is therefore extremely important for strategy and technology to align and develop the maximum possible value for the society. We always look at features, quality, and cost as some of the important drivers of corporate performance. But we also recognize that safety, health, and sustainability are important. Over time, particularly in recent times, it has come to a common understanding globally that environmental empathy, social responsibility, and corporate governance are extremely important. This course, Strategy and Technology, while delivering on the core premise, will also touch upon these aspects during the lecture sessions. What does this course offer for you? It is a very unique integration of the domains of strategy and technology. It is a blended course. Theories and models of developing strategy and deploying technology are blended with practical case studies and multiple practical examples. It teaches the learners how to acquire and deploy strategic skills and also how to integrate strategy with technology and vice versa. This course would provide you the building blocks of strategy. It will also outline the drivers of technology and enable you to deploy technology in a very strategic manner in the organizations. This would result in enterprise growth, economic prosperity, and professional fulfillment. This course is a 12-week course. There would be 60 lectures, 5 lectures per week, and there would be end of the week assignments as well. Each week will focus on one core theme, and each lecture will cover 2 specific subtopics. As I said, I will provide illustrative and experiential examples throughout, and I would wrap up this course with several case studies of technological innovation and enterprise growth. This course is indeed data and information rich. You would have around 1200 data and information rich slides in this course. I would present global as well as local perspectives of strategy and technology. To enhance visual appeal and to focus on certain core aspects, we have used images. To enhance visual appeal and also focus on core themes, I have used certain images from public domain. These are under Creative Commons policy purely for educational purposes, and copyrights of the image creators are fully respected. In terms of the detailing of the course, I would say that this 12-week course would focus on very important aspects of industry structure, corporate strategy, and technology. We will start off with understanding how structural and strategic analysis for industries is conducted. Various models and frameworks will be presented to you. I would then follow it up with conducting a series of lectures on how to formulate a corporate strategy. Several models are available which will be outlined for you. As important as formulating a good strategy is executing that, and the framework for execution is presented in week 3. We will then move on to developing competitive strategy, particularly the 3 competitive strategies which are the bedrock of any strategy formulation process. We will also look at in the following week on certain important groups of industry. These are buyers, suppliers and competitors. We will analyze the forces that these 3 entities create and how a firm can cope with the forces. And in week 6, we will try to relate structural analysis and competitive strategy, and we will understand how innovation, differentiation and niche can play out as technology embedded strategies. Every company would like to do more or less the same. Then how would the industry achieve certain kind of strategic equilibrium? And that strategic equilibrium would be not static, but it will be dynamic. So this framework, which is very unique to my course, is explained through novel concepts such as strategic comparators and responders, strategic balance, as well as quality cost value relationship. I'll also focus very much on collaboration as a theme of overall development rather than sheer competition. Then we will move on to technology as our core focus area. We'll talk about the linkage between technology and competitive strategy. I propose a framework of generic technology strategies. Then I will move on to technology as strategy driver and discuss the role of technology in innovation, differentiation and followership. Technology ultimately has to deliver on customer satisfaction, co-creation of value for the customer. So customer centricity will be an important aspect of week 10 lectures. Finally, we will focus on how technology can help overall business development. What are the strategic shifts technology can enable, and what are the business models that technology can drive? We will propose certain foundational process frameworks so that intellectual property can be created and can be commercialized for business development. We will also talk about national competitiveness as part of this week's lecture. Week 12, which is the final week, will have several technology case studies. We will demonstrate how technology has enabled certain ideas grow into firms, and eventually those firms became dominant forces in the industries they helped create. The unique features of this course are the following. It provides a very detailed and integrated overview of the multifaceted domains of strategy and technology. It helps the learner in developing the vision, mission and goals and crafting a strategic plan that can also be executed. So very importantly, we follow through planning process with the execution framework. Then this course will present multiple frameworks for enabling enterprise competitiveness, growth and sustainability. And this is a broad spectrum course. Students and working professionals in a wide range of industries and in a wide range of domains can benefit from this course. They can develop and hone strategy skills. They can understand how technology drives progress, and they can integrate multiple technology insights into their overall professional approach. This course aligns very much with the IITs and IIS's lead in the technology and strategy areas. Upon completion of the course, the participants are likely to achieve 4 important aspects of their professional development. 1, they will develop critical strategic skills. They understand how to conduct strategy formulation and execution. The art and science of strategy will be within the grasp of the learners. Secondly, strategists and managers will turn tech savvy because of undergoing this course. Similarly, technologists will become strategy savvy because of the inputs provided in this course. So you will be able to understand and appreciate the role of technology in strategy and vice versa, and deploy this combination effectively. Once participants are equipped like this, they would become future ready. They would integrate strategy and technology for futuristic and sustainable enterprise development. Ultimately, this course would help the participants become holistic managers and holistic leaders. People can evolve as holistic professionals who can enable and support state-of-the-art modernization along with futuristic transformation. I do hope that you would benefit a lot from this multifaceted course, and I look forward to seeing you when this course starts early next year. Thank you very much. Namaste.